now. So if we're ready to go, would you like to start or should I?
I don't know. What do you think? It's your stream after all.
I could go either way. I mean, I read the first little bit to get myself into the groove, but the rest of it I have not read in many, many years. 5 years, I think. So I'm
Okay.
attacking this blind, basically whichever one we choose.
You want me to start then?
It's completely up to you.
All right. I will start us off then
All right.
in Terry Pratchett's Mort. Let me find the first page. Now we'll take a sip of water. I believe the first section is 16 pages.
Sounds good.
This is the bright candlelit room where the lifetimers are stored. Shelf upon shelf of them, squat hourglasses, one for every living person, pouring their fine sand from the future into the past. The accumulated hiss of the falling grains makes the room roar like the sea. This is the owner of the room, stalking through it with a preoccupied air. His name is Death. But not any Death. This is the Death whose particular sphere of operations is, well, not a sphere at all, but the Discworld, which is flat and rides on the back of four giant elephants who stand on the shell of the enormous star turtle Great Atuin, and which is bounded by a waterfall that cascades endlessly into space. Scientists have calculated that the chance of anything so patently absurd actually existing are millions to one, but magicians have calculated that million to one chances crop up 9 times out of 10. Death clicks across the black and white tiled floor on toes of bone, muttering inside his cowl as his skeletal fingers count along the rows of busy hourglasses. Finally, he finds one that seems to satisfy him, lifts it carefully from its shelf, and carries it across to the nearest candle. He holds it so that the light glints off it, and stares at the little point of reflected brilliance. The steady gaze of those twinkling eye sockets encompasses the world turtle, sculling through the deeps of space. Carapace scarred by comets and pitted by meteors. One day, even Great Atuin will die. Death knows. Now that would be a challenge. But the focus of his gaze dives onwards towards the blue-green magnificence of the disk itself, turning slowly under its tiny orbiting sun. Now it curves away and towards the great mountain range called the Ram Tops. The Ram Tops are full of deep valleys and unexpected crags, and considerably more geography than they know what to do with. They have their own peculiar weather, full of shrapnel rain and whiplash winds and permanent thunderstorms. Some people say it's all because the Ram Tops are home to old wild magic. Mind you, some people will say anything. Death blinks, adjusts for depth of vision, and now he sees a grassy country in the turnwise slopes of the mountains. Now he sees a particular hillside. Now he sees a field. Now he sees a boy running. Now he watches. Now, in a voice like lead slabs being dropped on granite, he says, "Yes!" There was no doubt that there was something magical in the soil of that hilly, broken area, which, because of the strange tint that it gave to the local flora, was known as the Octarine grass country. For example, it was one of the few places on the disk where plants produced reannual varieties. Reannuals are plants that grow backwards in time. You sow the seed this year and they grow last year. Mort's family specialized in distilling the wine from reannual grapes. These were very powerful and much sought after by fortune tellers, since, of course, they enabled them to see the future. The only snag was that you got the hangover the morning before and had to drink a lot to get over it. Reannual growers tended to be big, serious men, much given to introspection and close examination of the calendar. A farmer who neglects to sow ordinary seeds only loses the crop, whereas anyone who forgets to sow seeds of a crop that has already been harvested 12 months before risks disturbing the entire fabric of causality, not to mention acute embarrassment. It was also acutely embarrassing for Mort's family that the youngest son was not at all serious and had about the same talent for horticulture that you would find in a dead starfish. It wasn't that he was unhelpful, but he had the kind of vague, cheerful helpfulness that serious men soon learn to dread. There was something infectious, possibly even fatal about it. He was tall, red-haired, and freckled, with the sort of body that seemed to be only marginally under its owner's control. It appeared to have been built entirely out of knees. On this particular day, it was hurtling across the high field, waving its hands and yelling. Mort's father and uncle watched it disconsolately from the stone wall. "What I don't understand," said Father Lezek, "is that the birds don't even fly away. I'd fly away if I saw it coming towards me. The human body's a wonderful thing. I mean, his legs go all over the place, but there's a fair turn of speed there." Mort reached the end of a furrow. An overfull wood pigeon. Yeah, an overfull wood pigeon lurched slowly out of his way. His heart's in the right place, mind, said Lezick carefully. Ah, of course, 'tis the rest of him that isn't. He's clean about the house. Doesn't eat much, said Lezick. No, I can see that. Lezick looked sideways at his brother, who was staring fixedly at the sky. I did hear you got a place going up at your farm, Hamish, he said. Ah, got an apprentice in, didn't I? Ah, Lezick said gloomily. When was that then? Yesterday, said his brother, lying with rattlesnake speed. All signed and sealed. Sorry, look, I got nothing against young Mort, see. He's as nice a boy as you could wish to meet. It's just that... I know, said Lezick. He couldn't find his arse with both hands. They stared at the distant figure. It had fallen over. Some pigeons had waddled over to inspect it. He's not stupid, mind, said Hamish. Not what you call stupid. There's a brain there, all right, Lezick conceded. Sometimes he starts thinking so hard he has to hit him around the head to get his attention. His granny taught him to read, see? I reckon it overheated his mind. Mort had got up and tripped over his robe. You ought to set him to a trade, said Hamish, reflectively. Priesthood, maybe, or wizardry. They do a lot of reading, wizards. They looked at each other. Into both their minds stole an inkling of what Mort might be capable of if he got his well-meaning hands on a book of magic. All right, said Hamish hurriedly. Something else, then. There must be lots of things he could turn his hand to. He starts thinking too much. That's the trouble, said Lezick. Look at him now. You don't think about how to scare birds, he just does it. A normal boy, I mean. Hamish scratched his chin thoughtfully. Could be someone else's problem, he said. Lezick's expression did not alter, but there was a subtle change around his eyes. How do you mean? He said. There's the hiring fair at Sheepridge next week. You set him as an apprentice. You set him as an apprentice, see, and his new master will have the job of knocking him into shape. 'Tis the law. Get him indentured, and 'tis binding. Lezick looked across the field at his son, who was examining a rock. I wouldn't want anything to happen to him, mind, he said doubtfully. We're quite fond of him, his mother and me. You get used to people. It'd be for his own good. You'll see. Make a man of him. Ah, well, there's certainly plenty of raw material, sighed Lezick. Mort was getting interested in the rock. It had curly shells in it, relics of the early days of the world when the Creator had made creatures out of stone. No one knew why. Mort was interested in lots of things. Why people's teeth fitted together so neatly, for example. He'd given that one a lot of thought. Then there was the puzzle of why the sun came out during the day instead of at night when the light would come in useful. He knew the standard explanation, which somehow didn't seem satisfying. In short, Mort was one of those people who are more dangerous than a bag full of rattlesnakes. He was determined to discover the underlying logic behind the universe, which was going to be hard because there wasn't one. The Creator had a lot of remarkably good ideas when he put the world together, but making it understandable hadn't been one of them. Tragic heroes always moan when the gods take an interest in them, but it's the people who the gods ignore who get the really tough deals. His father was yelling at him, as usual. Mort threw the rock at a pigeon, which was almost too full to lurch out of the way, and wandered back across the field. You take a sip of water real quick. And that was why Mort and his father walked down through the mountains into Sheepridge on Hogswatch Eve, with Mort's rather sparse possessions in a sack on the back of a donkey. The town wasn't much more than four sides to a cobbled square, lined with shops that provided all the service industry of the farming community. After 5 minutes, Mort came out of the tailor's wearing a loose-fitting brown garment of imprecise function, which had been understandably unclaimed by a previous owner and had plenty of room for him to grow, on the assumption that he would grow into a 19-legged elephant. His father regarded him critically. Very nice, he said. For the money? It itches, said Mort. I think there's things in here with me. There's thousands of lad in the world who'd be very thankful for a nice, warm, Levick paused and gave up. Uh, Garment, like that, my lad. I could share it with them? Mort said hopefully. You gotta look smart, said Lezick severely. You gotta make an impression. Stand out in the crowd. There was no doubt about it. He would. They sat out among the throng crowding the square, each listening to his own thoughts. Usually Mort enjoyed visiting the town with its cosmopolitan atmosphere and strange dialects from villages as far away as 5, even 10 miles, but this time he felt unpleasantly apprehensive, as if he could remember something that hadn't happened yet. The fair seemed to work like this. Men looking for work stood in ragged lines in the center of the square. Many of them sported little symbols in their hats to tell the world what kind of work they were trained in. Shepherds wore a wisp of wool, carters a hank of horsehair, interior decorators a strip of rather interesting Hessian wall covering, and so on. The boys seeking apprenticeships were clustered on the hub side of the square. You just go and stand there, and then someone comes and offers you an apprenticeship, said Lezik, his voice trimmed with uncertainty. If they like the look of you, that is. How do they do that? Said Mort. Well, said Lezik, and paused. Hamish hadn't explained about this bit. He drew on his limited knowledge of the marketplace, which was restricted to livestock sales, and ventured, I suppose they count your teeth in that. Make sure you don't wheeze and your feet are all right. Shouldn't let on about the reading. It unsettles people. And then what? Said Mort. Then you go and learn a trade, said Lezik. What trade in particular? Well, carpentry's a good one, Lezik hazarded. Or thievery. Someone's got to do it. Mort looked at his feet. He was a dutiful son when he remembered, and if being an apprentice was what was expected of him, then he was determined to be a good one. Carpentry didn't sound very promising, though. Wood had a stubborn life of its own and a tendency to split, and official thieves were rare in the Ramtops, where people weren't rich enough to afford them. All right, he said eventually. I'll go and give it a try, but what happens if I don't get apprenticed? Lezik scratched his head. I don't know, he said. I expect you just wait until the end of the fair. At midnight, I suppose. And now midnight approached. A light frost began to crisp the cobblestones. In the ornamental clock tower that looked over the square, a couple of delicately carved little automatons whirred out of trap doors in the clock face and struck the quarter hour. 15 minutes to midnight. Mort shivered, but the crimson fires of shame and stubbornness flared up inside him, hotter than the slopes of hell. He blew on his fingers for something to do and stared up at the freezing sky, trying to avoid the stares of the few stragglers among what remained of the fair. Most of the stall-keepers had packed up and gone. Even the hot meat pie man had stopped crying his wares and, with no regard for his personal safety, was eating one. The last of Mort's fellow hopefuls had vanished hours ago. He was a wall-eyed young man with a stoop and a running nose, and Sheepridge's one licensed beggar had pronounced him to be the ideal material. The lad on the other side of Mort had gone off to be a toy maker. One by one they had trooped off, the masons, the farriers, the assassins, the mercers, coopers, hoodwinkers, and ploughmen. In a few minutes, it would be the new year, and 100 boys would be starting out hopefully on their careers, new worthwhile lives of useful service rolling out in front of them. Mort wondered miserably why he hadn't been picked. He tried to look respectable, and he had looked all prospective masters squarely in the eye to impress them with his excellent nature and extremely likable qualities. This didn't seem to have the right effect. Would you like a hot meat pie? Said his father. No. You selling 'em cheap? No, thank you. No. Lezik hesitated. I, I could ask the man if he wants an apprentice, he said helpfully. Very reliable, the catering trade. I don't think he does, said Mort. No, probably not, said Lezik. Bit of a one-man business, I expect. He's gone now anyway. Tell you what, I'll save you a bit of mine. I don't actually feel very hungry, Dad. There's hardly any gristle. No, but thanks all the same. Oh. Lezik deflated a little. He danced about to stamp some life back into his feet and whistled a few tuneless bars between his teeth. He felt he ought to say something, to offer some kind of advice, to point out that life had its ups and downs, to put his arm around his son's shoulder and talk expansively about the problems of growing up, to indicate, in short, that the world is a funny old place where one should never, metaphorically speaking, be so proud as to turn down the offer of a perfectly good hot meat pie. They were alone now. The frost, the last one of the year, tightened its grip on the stones. High in the tower above them, a cogged wheel went clonk, tripped a lever, released a hatchet, and let a heavy lead weight drop down. There was a dreadful metallic wheezing noise, and the trapdoors in the clock face slid open, releasing the clockwork men. Swinging their hammers jerkily, as if they were afflicted with robotic arthritis, they began to ring in the new day. Well, that's it, said Lezik, hopefully. They'd have to find somewhere to sleep. Hog's Watch night was no time to be walking in the mountains. Perhaps there was a stable somewhere. It's not midnight until the last stroke, said Mort distantly. Lezik shrugged. The sheer strength of Mort's obstinacy was defeating him. All right, he said. We'll wait then. And then they heard the clip-clop of hooves, which boomed rather more loudly around a hilly square than common acoustics should really allow. In fact, clip-clop was an astonishingly inaccurate word for the kind of noise which rattled around Mort's head. Clip-clop suggested a rather jolly little pony, quite possibly wearing a straw hat with holes cut out for its ears. An edge to this sound made it very clear that straw hats weren't an option. The horse entered the square by the hub road, steam curling off its huge damp white flanks and sparks striking up from the cobbles beneath it. It trotted proudly, like a war charger. It was definitely not wearing a straw hat. The tall figure on its back was wrapped up against the cold. When the horse reached the center of the square, the rider dismounted, slowly, and fumbled with something behind the saddle. Eventually, he or she produced a nose bag, fastened it over the horse's ears, and gave it a friendly pat on the neck. The air took on a thick, greasy feel, and the deep shadows around Mort became edged with blue and purple rainbows. The rider strode towards him, black cloak billowing and feet making little clicking sounds on the cobbles. They were the only noises. Silence clamped down on the square like great drifts of cotton wool. The impressive effect was rather spoiled by a patch of ice. "Oh, bugger!" It wasn't exactly a voice. The words were there all right, but they arrived in Mort's head without bothering to pass through his ears. He rushed forward to help the fallen figure, and found himself grabbing hold of a hand that was nothing more than polished bone, smooth and rather yellowed like an old billiard ball. The figure's hood, the figure's hood fell back, and a naked skull turned its empty eye sockets towards them. Not quite empty, though. Deep within them, as though they were windows looking across the gulfs of space, were two tiny blue stars. It occurred to Mort that he ought to feel horrified, so he was slightly shocked to find that he wasn't. It was a skeleton sitting in front of him, rubbing its knees and grumbling, but it was a live one, curiously impressive, but not, for some strange reason, very frightening. "Thank you, boy," said the skull. "What is your name?" Uh, said Mort. "Mortimer, sir. They call me Mort." "What a coincidence," said the skull. "Help me up, please." The figure rose unsteadily, brushing itself down. Now Mort could see that there was a heavy belt around his waist, from which was slung a white-handled sword. "I hope you're not hurt, sir," he said politely. The skull grinned. Of course, Mort thought. It hadn't much of a choice. "No harm done, I am sure." The skull looked around and seemed to see Lezek, who appeared to be frozen to the spot. Uh, seemed to be frozen to the spot for the first time. Uh, Mort thought an explanation was called for. "My father," he said, trying to move protectively in front of Exhibit A without causing any offense. "Excuse me, sir, but are you Death?" "Correct. Full marks for observation, that boy." Mort followed. "My father is a good man," he said. He thought for a while and added, "Quite good. I'd rather you left him alone if it's all the same to you. I don't know what you've done to him, but I'd like you to stop it. No offense meant." Death stepped back, his skull on one side. "I have merely put us outside time for a moment," he said. "He will see and hear nothing that disturbs him. No, boy, it was you I came for." "Me?" "You are here seeking employment?" Light dawned on Mort. "You're looking for an apprentice?" he said. The eye sockets turned towards him, uh, their actinic pinpoints flaring. "Of course." Death waved a bony hand. There was a wash of purple light, a sort of visible pop, and Lezek unfroze. Above his head, the clockwork automatons got on with the job of proclaiming midnight, as time was allowed to come creeping back. Lezek blinked. "Oh, didn't see you there for a minute," he said. "Sorry, mine must have been elsewhere." "I was offering your boy a position," said Death. "I trust that meets with your approval." "What was your job again?" said Lezek, talking to a black-robed skeleton without showing even a flicker of surprise. "I usher souls into the next world," said Death. "Ah," said Lezek. "Of course. Sorry, should have guessed from the clothes. Very necessary work, very steady. Established business?" "I have been going for some time, yes," said Death. "Good, good. Never really thought of it as a job for Mort, you know, but it's good work. Good work. Always very reliable. What's your name?" "Death." "Dad," said Mort urgently. "Can't say I recognize the firm," said Lezek. "Where are you based exactly?" "From the uttermost depths of the sea to the heights where even the eagle may not go," said Death. "It's fair enough," nodded Lezek. "Well, Dad," said Mort, pulling at his father's coat. Death laid a hand on Mort's shoulder. "What your father sees and hears is not what you see and hear," he said. "Do not worry him. Do you think he would want to see me, in the flesh, as it were?" "But you're Death," said Mort. "You go around killing people." "I? Kill?" said Death, obviously offended. "Certainly not. People get killed, but that's their business. I just take over from then on. After all, it'd be a bloody stupid world if people got killed without dying, wouldn't it? Well, yes, said Mort doubtfully. Mort had never heard the word intrigued. It was not in regular use in the family vocabulary, but a spark in his soul told him that here was something weird and fascinating and not entirely horrible, and that if he let this moment go, he'd spend the rest of his life regretting it. And he remembered the humiliations of the day and the long walk back home. Uh, he began. I don't have to die to get the job, do I? Being dead is not compulsory. And the bones? Not if you don't want to. Mort breathed out again. It had been starting to prey on his mind. If father says it's all right, he said. They looked at Lezic, who was scratching his beard. How do you feel about this, Mort? He said, with the brittle brightness of a fever victim. It's not everyone's idea of an occupation. It's not what I had in mind, I admit. But they do say that undertaking is an honored profession. It's your choice. Undertaking? Said Mort. Death nodded, and raised his fingers to his lips in a conspiratorial gesture. It's interesting, said Mort slowly. I think I'd like to try it. Where'd you say your business was? Said Lezic. Is it far? No further than the thickness of a shadow, said Death. Where the first primal cell was, there was I also. Where man is, there I am. When the last life crawls under freezing stars, there will I be. Ah, said Lezic. You get about a bit then. He looked puzzled, like a man struggling to remember something important, and then obviously gave up. Death patted him on the shoulder in a friendly fashion and turned to Mort. Have you any possessions, boy? Uh, yes, said Mort, and then remembered. Only I think I left them in the shop. Dad, we left the sack in the clothes shop. It'll be shut, said Lezic. Shops don't open on Hog's Watch Day. You'll have to go back the day after tomorrow. Well, tomorrow now. It is of little account, said Death. We will leave now. No doubt I will have business here soon enough. I hope you'll be able to drop in and see us soon, said Lezic. He seemed to be struggling with his thoughts. I'm not sure that'll be a good idea, said Mort. Well, goodbye, lad, said Lezic. You're to do what you're told, you understand? And, excuse me, sir, do you have a son? Death looked rather taken aback. No, he said. I have no sons. I'll, I'll just have a word with my boy if you've no objection. Then I will go and see to the horse, said Death, with more than normal tact. Lezic put his arm around his son's shoulders, with some difficulty in view of their difference in height, and gently propelled him across the square. Mort, you know your Uncle Hamish told me about this apprenticing business, he whispered. Yes? Well, he told me something else, the old man confided. He said it's not unknown for an apprentice to inherit his master's business. What do you think of that, then? Uh, I'm not sure, said Mort. It's worth thinking about, said Lezic. I am thinking about it, father. Many a young lad has started out that way. Uh, what the hell? Many a young lad has started out that way, Hamish said. Makes himself useful, earns his master's confidence, and well, if there's any daughters in the house, did Mr. Mr. say anything about daughters? Mr. Who? Said Mort. Mr. Your new master. Oh, him. No, I don't think so, said Mort slowly. I don't think he's the marrying type. Many a keen young man owes his advancement to his nuptials, said Lezic. He does? Mort, I don't think you're really listening. What? Lezic came to a halt on the frosty cobbles and spun the boy around to face him. You're really gonna have to do better than this, he said. Don't you understand, boy? If you're gonna amount to anything in this world, then you've got to listen. I'm your father, and I'm telling you these things. Mort looked down at his father's face. He wanted to say a lot of things. He wanted to say how much he loved him, how worried he was. He wanted to ask what his father really thought he'd just seen and heard. He wanted to say that he felt as though he'd stepped on a molehill and found that it was really a volcano. He wanted to ask what nuptials meant. What he actually said was, Yes, thank you. I'd better be going. I'll try to write you a letter. There's bound to be someone in passing who can read it to us, said Lezic. Goodbye, Mort. He blew his nose. Goodbye, Dad. I'll come back to visit, said Mort. Death coughed tactfully, although it sounded like the pistol crack of an ancient beam full of Death Watch beetle. We had better be going, he said. Hop up, Mort. As Mort scrambled behind the ornate silver saddle, Death leaned down and shook Lezic's hand. Thank you, he said. He's a good lad at heart, said Lezic. A bit dreamy, that's all. I suppose we were all young once. Death considered this. No, he said. I don't think so. He gathered up the reins and turned the horse towards the rim road. From his perch behind the black-robed figure, Mort waved desperately. Lezak waved back. Then, as the horse and its two riders disappeared from view, he lowered his hand and looked at it. The handshake, it had felt strange, but somehow he couldn't remember exactly why.
Phew. Excellent. That is a
Thank you,
typo
thank you.
on the last page where it says Hamish spoke when Lezak
Yeah,
did. That's just a straight up
that
typo
I
that's
thought
in the
that was
book.
weird.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna take over for a bit.
All right.
I would just like to
Well,
say I have a completely different idea of the voices in this book, and I'm gonna do them completely differently. And I think you should keep yours, and we'll just have two completely different dubs going on.
yeah, I don't think that's an issue.
I think it's hilarious, actually.
All
Okay.
right.
Mort listened to the clatter of stone under the horse's hooves. Then there was the soft thud of packed earth as they reached the road, and then there was nothing at all. He looked down and saw the landscape spread out below him, the night edged with moonlit silver. If he fell off, the only thing he'd hit was air. He redoubled his grip on the saddle. Then Death said, "Are you hungry, boy?" Uh, yes, sir. The words came straight from his stomach without the intervention of his brain. Death nodded and reined in the horse. It stood on the air, the great circular panorama of the disk glittering below it. Here and there was a city. Here and there a city was an orange glow. In the warm seas nearer the rim there was a hint of phosphorescence. In some of the deep valleys that trapped the daylight of the disk, which is slow and slightly heavy, was evaporating like was the daylight. Oh, the trapped daylight of the disk, which is slow and slightly heavy, was evaporating like silver steam. Do you have this huge footnote here?
Oh yeah, I do.
I'm gonna read it like it's terms and conditions. Practically anything can go faster than disk light, which is lazy and tame, unlike ordinary light. The only thing known to go faster than ordinary light is monarchy, according to the philosopher Lai Tin Weedle. He reasoned like this: you can't have more than one king, and tradition demands that there is no gap between kings. So when a king dies, the succession was therefore passed to the heir instantaneously. Presumably, he said, there must be some elementary particles, king-ons or possibly queen-ons, that do this job, but of course succession sometimes fails if, in mid-flight, they strike an antiparticle, or republican. His ambitious plans to use the discovery to send messages involving the careful torturing of a small king in order to modulate the signal were never fully expounded, because, at that point, the bar had closed. But it was outshone by the glow that rose towards the stars from the rim itself. Vast streamers of light shimmered and glittered across the night. Great golden walls surrounded the world. "It's beautiful," said Mort softly. "What is it?" "The sun is under the disk," said Death. "It's like this every night?" "Every night," said Death. "Nature is like that." Doesn't anyone know?" "Me, you, the gods." "Good, is it?" "Gosh." Death leaned over the saddle and looked down at the kingdoms of the world. "I don't know about you," he said, but I could murder a curry." Although it was well after midnight, the twin city of Ankh-Morpork was roaring with life. Mort had thought Sheepridge looked busy, but compared to the turmoil of the street around him, the town was, well, a morgue. Poets have tried to describe Ankh-Morpork. They have failed. Perhaps it's the sheer zestful vitality of the place, or maybe that it's just that a city with 1 million inhabitants and no sewers is rather robust for poets, who prefer daffodils and no wonder. So let's just say that Ankh-Morpork is as full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, as loud as a curse in a cathedral, as bright as an oil slick, as colorful as a bruise, and as full of activity, industry, bustle, and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on a termite mound. Ankh-Morpork, that's correct. There were temples, their doors wide open, filling the streets with the sounds of gongs, cymbals, and in the case of some of the more conservative fundamentalist religions, the brief screams from their victims. There were shops whose strange wares spilled out onto the pavement. There seemed to be a rather lot of friendly young ladies who couldn't afford many clothes. There were flares and jugglers and assorted sellers of instant transcendence. And Death stalked through it all. Mort had half expected him to pass through the crowds like smoke, but it wasn't like that at all. The simple truth was that wherever Death walked, people just drifted out of the way. It didn't work like that for Mort. The crowds that gently parted for his new master closed again just in time to get in his way. His toes got trodden on, his ribs were bruised, and people kept trying to sell him unpleasant spices and suggestively shaped vegetables. And a rather elderly lady said, against all evidence, that he looked a well set up young lad who would like a nice time. He thanked her very much and said that he hoped he was having a nice time already. Death reached the street corner, the light from the flares raising brilliant highlights on the polished dome of his skull, and sniffed the air. A drunk staggered up and, without quite realizing why, made a slight detour in his erratic passage for no visible reason. "This is the city, boy," said Death. "What do you think?" "It's very big," said Mort uncertainly. "I mean, why does anyone want to live all squeezed together like this?" Death shrugged. "I like it," he said. "It's full of life." Sir? "Yes?" "What's a curry?" The blue fires flared deep in the eyes of Death. "Have you ever bitten a red-hot ice cube?" "No, sir," said Mort. "Curry's like that." Sir? "Yes?" Mort swallowed hard. Excuse me, sir, but my dad said if I don't understand, I was to ask questions, sir." "Very commendable," said Death. He set off down a side street, the crowds parting in front of him like random molecules. "Well, sir, I can't help noticing. The point is, well, the plain fact of it, sir, is—" "Out with it, boy." How can you eat things, sir?" Death pulled up short so that Mort walked into him. When the boy started to speak, he waved him into silence. He appeared to be listening to something. "There are times, you know," he said, half to himself, "when I get really upset." He turned on one heel and set off down an alleyway at high speed, his cloak flying out behind him. The alley wound between dark walls and sleeping buildings, not so much a thoroughfare as a meandering gap. Death stopped by a decrepit water butt and plunged his arm in at full length, bringing out a small sack with a brick tied to it. He drew his sword, a line of flickering blue fire in the darkness, and sliced through the string. "I get very angry indeed," he said. He appended the sack, and Mort watched the pathetic scraps of sodden fur slide out to lie in their spreading puddle in the cobbles. Excuse me. Death reached out with his white fingers and stroked them gently. After a while, something like gray smoke curled up from the kittens and formed 3 small cat-shaped clouds in the air. They billowed occasionally, unsure of their shape, and blinked at Mort with puzzled gray eyes. When he tried to touch one, his hand went straight through it and tingled. "You don't see people at their best in this job," said Death. He blew on a kitten, sending it gently tumbling. Its meow of compliance sounded as though it had come from a long way away via a thin tube. "They're souls, aren't they?" said Mort. "What do people look like?" "People-shaped," said Death. "It's basically all down to the characteristic morphogenic field." He sighed like the swish of a shroud, picked the kittens out of the air, and carefully stowed them away somewhere in the dark recesses of his robe. He stood up. "Curry time," he said. It was crowded in the curry gardens on the corner of God Street and Blood Alley, but only the cream of society, at least with those people who are found floating on the top, and who, therefore, it's wisest to call the cream. Fragrant bushes planted among the tables nearly concealed the basic smell of the city itself, which has been likened to the nasal equivalent of a foghorn. Most ate ravenously, but curbed... Mort, not most. Mort ate ravenously, but curbed his curiosity and didn't watch to see how Death could possibly eat anything. The food was there to start with and wasn't there later, so presumably something must have happened in between. Mort got the feeling that Death wasn't really used to all this, but was doing it to put him at ease, like an elderly bachelor uncle who's been landed with his nephew for a holiday and is terrified of getting it wrong. The other diners didn't take much notice, even when Death leaned back and lit a rather fine pipe. Someone with smoke curling out of their eye sockets takes some ignoring, but everyone managed it. "Is it magic?" said Mort. "What do you think?" said Death. "Am I really here, boy?" Yes, said Mort slowly. I, I've watched people. They look at you, but they don't see you, I think. You do something to their minds. Death shook his head. They do it all themselves, he said. There's no magic. People can't see me. They simply won't allow themselves to do it. Until it's time, of course. Wizards can see me, and cats. But your average human? No, never. He blew a smoke ring at the sky and added, Strange but true. Mort watched the smoke ring wobble into the sky and drift away towards the river. I can see you, he said. That's different. The Clatchian waiter arrived with the bill and placed it in front of Death. The man was squat and brown, with a hairstyle like a coconut gone nova, and his round face creased into a puzzled frown when Death nodded politely to him. He shook his head like someone trying to dislodge soap from his ears and walked away. Excuse me. Death reached into the depths of his robe and brought out a large leather bag full of assorted copper coinage, most of it blue and green with age. He inspected the bill carefully, then he counted out a dozen coins. Come, he said, standing up. We must go. Mort trotted along behind him as he stalked out of the garden and into the street, which was still fairly busy, even though there were first suggestions of dawn were on the horizon. What are we going to do now? Buy you some new clothes. These were new today. Yesterday, I mean. Really? Father said the shop was famous for its budget clothing, said Mort, running to keep up. It certainly adds a new terror to poverty. They turned into a wider street leading into a more affluent part of the city. The torches were closer together, and the middens further apart. There were no stalls and alley corner traders here, but proper buildings with signs hanging outside. They weren't mere shops, they were emporia. They had purveyors in them, and chairs and spittoons. Most of them were open even at this time of night because the average Ankian trader can't sleep for thinking of the money he's not making. Doesn't anyone ever go to bed around here? Said Mort. This is a city, said Death, and pushed open the door of a clothing store. When they came out 20 minutes later, Mort was wearing a neatly fitting black robe with faint silver embroidery, and the shopkeeper was looking at a handful of antique copper coins and wondering precisely how he came to possess them. How do you get all those coins? Said Mort. In pairs. It's a Death joke. An all-night barber sheared Mort's hair into the latest fashion among the city's young bloods, while Death relaxed in the next chair, humming to himself. Much to his surprise, he felt in a good humor. In fact, after a while, he pushed his hood back and glanced up at the barber's apprentice, who tied a towel around his neck in that unseeing, hypnotized way that Mort was coming to recognize, and said, A splash of toilet water and polish, my good man. An elderly wizard having a beard trim on the other side stiffened when he heard those somber, leaden tones and swung around. He blanched and muttered a few protective incantations after Death turned, very slowly for maximum effect, and treated him to a grin. A few minutes later, feeling rather self-conscious and chilly around the ears, Mort was heading back towards the stables where Death had lodged his horse. He tried an experimental swagger. He felt his new suit and haircut rather demanded it. It didn't quite work. Mort awoke. He lay looking at the ceiling while his memory did a fast rewind to the events of the previous day, crystallized in his mind like little ice cubes. He couldn't have met Death. He couldn't have eaten a meal with a skeleton with glowing blue eyes. It had to be a weird dream. He couldn't have ridden pillion on a great white horse that cantered up to the sky and then went... Where? The answer floated into his mind with all the inevitability of a tax demand. Here. His searching hands reached up to his cropped hair and down to sheets of some smooth, slippery material. It was much finer than the wool he was used to at home, which was coarse and always smelled of sheep. It felt warm, like dry ice. It felt like warm, dry ice. He swung out of the bed hastily and stared around the room. First of all, it was large, larger than the entire house back home, and dry. Dry as old tombs under ancient deserts. Excuse me. The air tasted as though it had been cooked for a few hours and then allowed to cool. The carpet under his feet was deep enough to hide a tribe of pygmies and crackled electrically as he padded through it, and everything had been designed in shades of purple and black. He looked down at his own body, which was wearing a long white nightshirt. His clothes had been neatly folded on a chair by the bed. The chair, he couldn't help noticing, was delicately carved with a skull and bones motif. Mort sat down on the edge of the bed and began to dress, his mind racing. He eased open the heavy oak door and felt oddly disappointed when it failed to creak ominously. There was a bare wooden corridor outside, with big yellow candles set in holders on the far wall. Mort crept out and sidled along the boards until he reached a staircase. He negotiated that successfully without anything ghastly happening, arriving in what looked like an entrance hall full of doors. There were a lot of funeral drapes here, and a grandfather clock with a tick like the heartbeat of a mountain. There was an umbrella stand beside it. It had a scythe in it. Mort looked around the doors. They looked important. Their arches were carved in the now familiar bones motif. He went and tried the nearest one, and a voice behind him said, "You mustn't go in there, boy." It took him a moment to realize this wasn't a voice in his head, but real human words that had been formed by a mouth and transferred to his ears by a convenient system of air compression, as nature intended. Nature had gone to a lot of trouble for 6 words with a slightly petulant tone to them. He turned around. There was a girl there, almost his own height and perhaps a few years older than him. She had silver hair and eyes with a pearly sheen to them, and the kind of interesting but impractical long dress that tends to be worn by tragic heroines who clasp single roses in their bosom while gazing soulfully at the moon. Mort had never heard the phrase pre-Raphaelite, which was a pity because it would have been almost the right description. However, such girls tend to be on the translucent and consumptive side, whereas this one had a slight suggestion of too many chocolates. She stared at him with her head on one side and one foot tapping irritably on the floor. Then she reached out quickly and pinched him sharply on the arm. "Ow!" "Huh, so you're really real," she said. "What's your name, boy?" "Mortimer. They call me Mort," he said, rubbing his elbow. "What did you do that for?" "I shall call you boy," she said. "And I don't really have to explain myself, you understand, but you must know I thought you were dead. You look dead." Mort said nothing. "Lost your tongue?" Mort was, in fact, counting to 10. "I'm not dead," he said eventually. "At least I don't think so. It's a little hard to tell. Who are you?" "You may call me Miss Isabel," she said haughtily. "Father told me that you must have something to eat, so follow me." She swept away towards one of the other doors. Mort trailed behind her at just the right distance to have it swing back and hit his other elbow. There's a fucking hair in my face is what there is. There was a kitchen on the other side of the door, long, low, and warm, with copper pans hanging from the ceiling, and a vast black iron stove occupying the whole of one long wall. An old man was standing in front of it, frying eggs and bacon and whistling between his teeth. The smell attracted Mort's taste buds from across the room, hinting that if they got together they could really enjoy themselves. He found himself moving forward without even consulting his legs. "Albert!" snapped Isabel. "Another one for breakfast." The man turned his head slowly and nodded to her without saying a word. She turned back to Mort. "I must say," she said, "that the whole disc to choose from, I should think Father could have gone rather better than you. I suppose you'll just have to do." She swept out of the room, slamming the door behind her. "Have to do what?" Mort said to no one in particular. "You want to take it?" Okay.
I was muted.
The
I'm checking where the next cutoff is for
oh yeah.
next
I mean,
questions.
that's good too. Yeah.
Ooh,
Where is it?
where is it? We're on page 25 now, and it
It's 31
switches
for me. Yeah.
to the next. Uh, Man, I'm not seeing it. We
Uh,
can switch off.
yeah. Go ahead.
All right, so where were we? I have to do what? The room was silent, except for the sizzle of the frying pan and the crumbling of coals in the molten heart of the stove. Mort saw that it had the words, "The Little Moloch," patent pending, embossed on its oven door. Patented? Patented. Embossed on its oven door. The cook didn't seem to notice him, so Mort pulled up a chair and sat down at the white scrubbed table. "Mushrooms?" said the old man without looking around. "Hmm? Huh? What?" "I said, do you want mushrooms?" Oh, sorry, no, thank you," said Mort. "Right you are, young sir." He turned around and set out for the table. Even after he got used to it, Mort always held his breath when he watched Albert walking. Death's manservant was one of those stick-thin, raw-nosed old men who always looked as if they were wearing gloves with the fingers cut out, even when they're not, and his walking involved a complicated sequence of movements. Albert leaned forward and his left arm started to swing, slowly at first, but soon evolving into a wild, jerking movement that finally and suddenly, at about the time when a watcher would have expected the arm to fly off at the elbow, transferred itself down the length of his body to his legs and propelled him forward like a high-speed stilt walker. The frying pan followed a series of intricate curves in the air and was brought to a halt just over Mort's plate. Albert did indeed have exactly the right type of half-moon spectacles to peer over the top of. "There could be some porridge to follow," he said, and winked, apparently to include Mort in the world porridge conspiracy. Excuse me," said Mort, "but where am I exactly?" "Don't you know? This is the house of death, lad. He brought you here last night." "I sort of remember, only—" "Hmm?" "Well, the bacon and eggs," said Mort, vaguely. "It doesn't seem, well, appropriate." "I've got some black pudding somewhere," said Albert. "No, I mean—" Mort hesitated. "It's just that I can't see him sitting down to a couple of rashers and a fried slice." Albert grinned. "No, he doesn't, lad. Not as a regular thing, no. Very easy to cater for, the master. I just cook for me, and—" He paused. "The young lady, of course." Mort nodded. "Your daughter," he said. "Mine? Ha!" said Albert. "You're wrong there. She's his." Mort stared down at his fried eggs. They stared back from their lake of fat. Albert had heard of nutritional values and didn't hold with them. "Are we talking about the same person?" he said at last. "Tall, wears black." Oh wait, no, there's more. "Tall, wears black, he's a bit skinny." "Adopted," said Albert kindly. "It's a rather long story." A bell jangled by his head. "Which will have to wait. He wants to see you in his study. I should run along if I were you. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." "Understandable, really. Up the steps and first door on the left. You can't miss it." "It's got skulls and bones around the door," said Mort, pushing back his chair.
They all have.
"Most of them," sighed Albert. "It's only his fancy. He doesn't mean anything by it." Leaving his breakfast to congeal, Mort hurried up the steps along the corridor and paused in front of the first door. He raised his hand to knock. "Enter!" The handle turned of its own accord. The door swung inward. Uh, Death was seated behind a desk, peering intently into a vast leather book almost bigger than the desk itself. He looked up as Mort came in, keeping one cal- calcareous finger marking his place, and grinned. Again, there wasn't much of an alternative. "Ah," he said, and then paused. Then he scratched his chin, with a noise like a fingernail being pulled across a comb. "Who are you, boy?" "Mort, sir," said Mort. "Your apprentice, you remember?" Death stared at him for some time. Then the pinpoint blue eyes turned back to the book. "Oh, yes," he said. "Mort. Well, boy, do you sincerely wish to learn the uttermost secrets of time and space?" "Yes, sir, I think so, sir." "Good. The stables are around the back. The shovel hangs just inside the door." He looked down, and then looked back up. Mort hadn't moved. "Is it by any chance possible that you fail to understand me?" "Not fully, sir," said Mort. "Dung, boy, dung! Albert has a compost heap in the garden. I imagine there's a wheelbarrow somewhere on the premises. Get on with it." Mort nodded mournfully. "Yes, sir. I see, sir." "Sir?" "Yes?" "Sir, I don't see what this has to do with the secrets of time and space." Death did not look up from his book. "That," he said, "is because you are here to learn." It is a fact that although the death of the Discworld is, in his own words, an anthropomorphic personification, he long ago gave up using the traditional skeletal horses, because of the bother of having to stop all the time to wire bits back on. Now his horses were always flesh and blood beasts from the finest stock, and Mort learned very well fed. Some jobs offer increments. This one offered, well, quite the reverse. But at least it was in the warm and fairly easy to get the hang of. After a while, he got into the rhythm of it and started playing the private little quantity surveying game that everyone plays in these circumstances. Let's see, he thought. I've done nearly a quarter. Let's call it a third. So when I've done that corner by the hay rack, it'll be more than half. Call it 5/8, which means 3 more wheelbarrow loads. It doesn't prove anything very much, except that the awesome splendor of the universe is much easier to deal with if you think of it in a series of small chunks. The horse watched him from its stall, occasionally trying to eat his hair in a friendly sort of way. After a while, he became aware that someone else was watching him. The girl, Isabel, was leaning on the half door, her chin in her hands. "Are you a servant?" she said. Mort straightened up. "No," he said. "I'm an apprentice." "That's silly. Albert said you can't be an apprentice." Mort concentrated on hefting a shovelful into the wheelbarrow. 2 more shovelfuls, call it 3 if it's well pressed. If it's well pressed down, and that means 4 barrows. All right, call it 5 before I've done halfway to the. "He says," said Isabel in a louder voice, "that apprentices become masters, and you can't have more than one death, so you're just a servant, and you have to do what I say." And then 8 more barrows means it's all done all the way to the door, which is nearly 2/3 of the whole thing, which means, "Did you hear what I said, boy?" Mort nodded, and then it'll be 14 more barrows, only call it 15 because I haven't swept up properly in the corner, and have you lost your tongue? Mort, said Mort mildly. She looked at him furiously. What? My name is Mort, said Mort. Or Mortimer. Most people call me Mort. Did you want to talk to me about something? She was speechless for a moment, staring from his face to the shovel and back again. Only I've been told to get on with this, said Mort. She exploded. Why are you here? Why did father bring you here? He hired me at the hiring fair, said Mort. All the boys got hired. And me. And you wanted to be hired? She snapped. He's death, you know. The Grim Reaper. He's very important. He's not something you become. He's something you are. Mort gestured vaguely at the wheelbarrow. I expect it'll turn out for the best, he said. My father always says things generally do. He picked up the shovel and turned away, and grinned at the horse's backside as he heard Isabel snort and walk away. Mort worked steadily through the sixteenths, eighths, quarters, and thirds, wheeling the barrow out through the yard to the heap by the apple tree. Death's garden was big, neat, and well tended. It was also very, very black. The grass was black, the flowers were black, black apples gleamed among the black leaves of a black apple tree. Even the air looked inky. After a while, Mort thought he could see. No, he couldn't possibly imagine he could see different colors of black. That's to say, not simply very dark tones of red and green and whatever, but real shades of black, a whole spectrum of colors, all different and all, well, black. He tipped out the last load, put the barrow away, and went back to the house. Enter! Death was standing behind a lectern, poring over a map. He looked at Mort as if he wasn't entirely there. You haven't heard of the Bay of Mant, have you? He said. No, sir, said Mort. Famous shipwreck there. Was there? There will be, said Death, if I can find the damn place. Mort walked around the lectern and peered at the map. You're going to sink the ship, he said. Death looked horrified. Certainly not. There will be a combination of bad seamanship, shallow water, and contrary wind. That's horrible, said Mort. Will there be many drowned? That's up to fate, said Death, turning to the bookcase behind him and pulling out a heavy gazetteer. There's nothing I can do about it. What is that smell? Me, said Mort simply. Ah, the stables! Death paused, his hand on the spine of the book. And why do you think I directed you to the stables? Think carefully now. Mort hesitated. He had been thinking carefully, in between counting wheelbarrows. He'd wondered if it had been to coordinate his hand and eye, or teach him the habit of obedience, or bring home to him the importance, on the human scale, of small tasks, or make him realize that even great men must start at the bottom. None of these explanations seemed exactly right. I think, he began. Yes? Well, I think it was because you were up to your knees in horse shit, to tell you the truth. Death looked at him for a long time. Mort shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. Absolutely correct, snapped Death. Clarity of thought, realistic approach, very important in a job like ours. Uh, yes, sir. Sir? Death was struggling with the index. People die all the time, sir, don't they? Millions. You must be very busy, but Death gave Mort the look he was coming to be familiar with. It started off as blank surprise, flickered briefly towards annoyance, called in for a drink at recognition, and settled finally on vague forbearance. But I'd have thought you'd have been, well, out and about a bit more, stalking the streets. My granny's almanac, my granny's almanac's got a picture of you with a scythe and stuff. I see. I'm afraid it is hard to explain unless you know about point incarnation and node focusing. I don't expect you do. I don't think so. Generally, I'm only expected to make an actual appearance on special occasions. Like a king, I suppose, said Mort. I mean, a king is reigning even when he's doing something else or asleep. Or asleep even. Is that it, sir? It'll do, said Death, rolling up the maps. And now, boy, if you've finished the stable, you can go and see if Albert has any jobs he wants doing. If you like, you can come out on the round with me this evening. Mort nodded. Death went back to his big leather book, took up a pen, stared at it for a moment, and then looked up at Mort with a skull on one side. Have you met my daughter? He said. Yes, sir, said Mort, his hand on the doorknob. She is a very pleasant girl, said Death, but I think she quite likes having someone her own age around to talk to. Sir? And of course, one day all this will belong to her. Something like a small blue supernova flared for a moment in the depths of his eye sockets. It dawned on Mort that, with some embarrassment and complete lack of expertise, Death was trying to wink. Let's see. In a landscape that owed nothing to time and space, which appeared on no map, which existed only in those far reaches of the multiplex cosmos, known to the few astrophysicists who have taken really bad acid, Mort spent the afternoon helping Albert plant out broccoli. It was black, tinted with purple. He tries, see, said Albert, flourishing the dibber. The fuck is a dibber?
Don't know.
It's just that when it comes to color, he hasn't got much imagination. I'm not sure I understand all this, said Mort. Did you say he made all this? Beyond the garden wall, the ground dropped towards a deep valley and then rose into dark moorland that marched all the way to distant mountains, jagged as cat's teeth. Yeah, said Albert. Mind what you're doing with that watering can. What was here before? I don't know, said Albert, starting a fresh row. Armament, I suppose. That's the fancy name for raw nothing. It's not a very good job of work, to tell the truth. I mean, the garden's okay, but the mountains are downright shoddy. They're all fuzzy when you get up close. I went and had a look once. Mort squinted hard at the trees nearest him. They seemed commendably solid. What do you do it all for? He said. Albert grunted. Do you know what happens to lads who ask too many questions? Mort thought for a moment. No, he said eventually. What? There was silence. Then Albert straightened up and said, Damned if I know. Probably they get answers, and serve 'em right. He said I could go out with him tonight, said Mort. You're a lucky boy then, aren't you? Said Albert, vaguely heading back for the cottage. Did he really make all this? Said Mort, tagging along after him. Yes. Why? I suppose he wanted somewhere where he could feel at home. Are you dead, Albert? Me? Do I look dead? The old man snorted when Mort started to give him a slow, critical look. And you can stop that. I'm alive as you are. Probably more. Sorry. Right. Bert pushed open the back door and turned to regard Mort as kindly as he could manage. It's best not to ask all these questions, he said. It upsets people. Now, how about a nice fry-up? The bell rang while they were playing dominoes. Mort sat to attention. I want the horse made ready, said Albert. Come on. They went out to the stable in the gathering dusk, and Mort watched the old man saddle up Death's horse. His name's Binky, said Albert, fastening the girth. Just goes to show you. You can never tell. Binky tried to eat his scarf in an affectionate way. Mort remembered the woodcut in his grandmother's almanac, between the page on planting times and the phases of the moon section, showing Death the Great Leveler come to all men. He stared at it hundreds of times when learning his letters. It wouldn't have been half so impressive if it had been generally known that the flame-breathing horse the Spectre rode was called Binky. Uh, this is Albert. I would have thought something like Fang or Saber or Ebony, Albert continued, but the master will have his little fancies, you know. Looking forward to it, are you? I think so, Mort said uncertainly. I've never seen death actually at work. Not many have, said Albert. Not twice, at any rate. Mort took a deep breath. About this daughter of his, he began. Ah, good evening, Albert, boy. Mort, said Mort automatically. Death strode into the stable, stooping a little to clear the ceiling. Albert nodded, not in any subservient way, Mort noticed, but simply out of form. Mort had met one or two servants, on the rare occasions he'd been taken into town, and Albert wasn't like any of them. He seemed to act as though the house really belonged to him, and its owner was just a passing guest. Something to be tolerated, like peeling paintwork or spiders in the lavatory. Death put up with it too, as though he and Albert had said everything that needed to be said a long time ago, and were uh, simply content now to get on with their jobs with the minimum of inconvenience all round. To Mort, it was rather like going for a walk after a really bad thunderstorm. Everything was quite fresh, nothing was particularly unpleasant, but there was this sense of vast energies just expended. Finding out about Albert tagged itself onto the end of his list of things to do. Hold this, said Death, and pushed a scythe into his hand while he swung himself up onto Binky. The scythe looked normal enough, except for the blade. It was so thin that Mort could see through it, a pale blue shimmer in the air that could slice flame and chop sound. He held it very carefully. Right, boy, said Death. Come on up. Albert, don't wait up. The horse trotted out of the courtyard and into the sky. There should have been a flash or rush of stars. The air should have spiraled and turned into speeding sparks, such as normally happens in the common everyday trans-dimensional hyperjumps. But this was Death, who has mastered the art of going everywhere without ostentation and could slide between dimensions as easily as he could slip through a locked door. And they moved at an easy gallop through cloud canyons, past great billowing mountains of cumulus, until the wisp parted in front of them and the disk lay below, basking in sunlight. That's because time is adjustable, said Death when Mort pointed this out. It's not really important. I always thought it was. People think it's important only because they invented it, said Death somberly. Mort considered this rather trite, but decided not to argue. What are we going to do now? He said. There's a promising war in Klachistan, said Death. Several plague outbreaks, one rather important assassination, if you'd prefer. What, a murder? Aye, a king. Oh, kings, said Mort dismissively. He knew about kings. Once a year, a band of strolling players, or at any rate ambling ones, came to Sheepridge, and the plays they performed were invariably about kings. Kings were always killing one another or being killed. The plots were quite complicated, involving mistaken identity, poison, battles, long-lost sons, ghosts, witches, and usually lots of daggers. Since it was clear that being a king was no picnic, uh, it was amazing that half the cast were apparently trying to become one. Mort's idea of palace life was a little hazy, but he imagined that no one got much sleep. I'd quite like to see a real king, he said. They wear crowns all the time, my granny said, even when they go to the lavatory. Death considered this carefully. There's no technical reason why not, he conceded. In my experience, however, it is generally not the case. The horse wheeled, and a vast flat checkerboard of the Stowe plain sped underneath them at lightning speed. This was rich country, full of silt and rolling cabbage fields and neat little kingdoms whose boundaries wriggled like snakes as small, formal wars, marriage, complex alliances, and the occasional bit of sloppy cartography changed the political shape of the land. This king, said Mort, as the forest zipped beneath them, is he good or bad? I never concern myself with such things, said Death. He's no worse than any other king, I imagine. Does he have people put to death? Said Mort, and remembering who he was talking to, added, saving your honor's presence, of course. Sometimes there are some things you have to do when you're a king. A city slid below them, clustered around a castle built on a rock outcrop that poked up out of the plain like a geological pimple. It was one huge rock from the distant ram tops. Death said, left there by the retreating ice in the legendary days when the ice giants waged war on the gods and rode their glaciers across the land in an attempt to freeze the whole world. They'd given up in the end, however, uh, and driven their great glittering flocks back to the hidden lands among the razor-backed mountains near the hub. Uh, no one on the plains knew why they had done this. It was generally considered by the younger generation in the city of Stowlot, the city around the rock, that it was because the place was dead boring. I need some water. Um, Binky trotted down over nothingness and touched down on the flagstones of the castle's topmost tower. Death dismounted and told Mort to sort out the nest egg. "Won't people notice there's a horse up here?" he said, as they strolled to a stairwell. Death shook his head. "Would you believe there could be a horse at the top of this tower?" he said. "No, you couldn't get one up these stairs," said Mort. "Well then?" Oh, I see. People don't want to see what can't possibly exist. Well done." Now they were walking along a wide corridor hung with tapestries. Death reached into his robe and pulled out an hourglass, peering closely at it in the dim light. It was a particularly fine one, its glass cut into intricate facets and imprisoned in an ornate frame of wood and brass. The words King King Oliver the Bastard were engraved deeply into it. The sand inside sparkled oddly. There wasn't a lot left. Death hummed to himself and stowed the glass away in whatever mysterious recess it had occupied. And then they turned the corner and hit a wall of sound. There was a hall full of people there, under a cloud of smoke and chatter that rose all the way up to the banner-haunted shadows in the roof. Up in the gallery, a trio of minstrels were doing their best to be heard and not succeeding. The appearance of Death didn't cause much of a stir. A footman by the door turned to him, opened his mouth, and then frowned in a distracted way and thought of something else. A few courtiers glanced in their direction, their eyes instantly unfocusing as common sense overruled the other five. "We've got a few minutes," said Death, taking a drink from a passing tray. "Let's mingle." "They can't see me either," said Mort. "But I'm real." "Reality is not always what it seems," said Death. "Anyway, if they don't want to see me, they certainly don't want to see you. These are aristocrats, boy. They're good at not seeing things. Why is there a cherry on a stick in this drink?" Mort said Mort automatically. "It's not as if it does anything for the flavor. Why does anyone take a perfectly good drink and then put in a cherry on a pole?" "What's going to happen next?" said Mort. An elderly earl bumped into his elbow, looked everywhere but directly at him, shrugged, and walked away. "Take these things, now," said Death, fingering a passing canapé. "I mean, mushrooms, yes, chickens, yes, cream, yes, I've nothing against any of them, but why in the name of sanity mince them all up and put them in little pastry cases?" "Pardon?" said Mort. "That's mortals for you," Death continued. "They've only got a few years in this world, and uh, they spend them all in making things complicated for themselves. Fascinating. Have a gherkin." "Where's the king?" said Mort, craning to look over the heads of the court. "Chap with the golden beard," said Death. He tapped a flunky on the shoulder, and as the man turned and looked around in puzzlement, deftly piloted another drink from his tray. Mort cast, Mort cast around until he saw the figure standing in a little group in the center of the crowd, leaning over slightly, uh, the better to hear him, the better to hear what a rather short courtier was saying to him. What a fucking sentence. You know, I'm gonna stop here and say, good lord, it is hard to read a British man's writing from the 80s.
Yeah.
Uh, he was a tall, heavy-built man with the kind of stolid, patient face that one would confidently buy a used horse from. "He doesn't look like a bad king," said Mort. "Why would anyone want to kill him?" "You see the man next to him, with the little mustache and the grin like a lizard?" Death pointed with his scythe. "Yes?" "His cousin, the Duke of Stohalet. Not the nicest of people," said Death. "A handy man with a bottle of poison, fifth in line to the throne last year, now second in line. Bit of a social climber, you might say." He fumbled inside his robe and produced an hourglass in which black sand coursed between a spiked iron latticework. He gave it an experimental shake. "And due to live another 35 years," he said with a sigh. "And he goes around killing people?" said Mort. He shook his head. "There's no justice." Death sighed. "No," he said, handing his drink to a page who was surprised to find he was suddenly holding an empty glass. "There's just me." He drew his sword, which had the same ice blue, shadow-thin blade as the scythe, as the scythe of office and stepped forward. I thought you used the scythe, whispered Mort. Kings get the sword, said Death. It's a royal what's name? Prerogative. His free hand thrust its bony digits beneath his robe again and brought out King Olair's glass. In the top half, the last few grains of sand were huddling together. Pay careful attention, said Death. You may be asked questions afterwards. Wait, said Mort wretchedly. It's not fair. Can't you stop it? Fair, said Death. Who said anything about fair? Well, if the other man is such a... Listen, said Death. Fair doesn't come into it. You can't take sides. Good grief, when it's time, it's time. That's all there is to it, boy. Mort, moaned Mort, staring at the crowd. And then he saw her. A random movement in the people opened up a channel between Mort and a slim, red-haired girl seated among a group of older women behind the king. She wasn't exactly beautiful, being over-endowed in the freckle department and frankly rather on the skinny side, but the sight of her caused a shock that hot-wired Mort's hindbrain and drove it all the way to the pit of his stomach, laughing nastily. It's time, said Death, giving Mort a nudge with a sharp elbow. Follow me. Death walked towards the king, weighing his sword in his hand. Mort blinked and started to follow. The girl's eyes met his for a second and immediately looked away, then swiveled back, dragging her head around, her mouth starting to open in an O of horror. Mort's backbone melted. He started to run towards the king. Look out! He screamed. You're in great danger! And the world turned into treacle. It began to fill up with blue and purple shadows, like a heat-stroke dream, and sound faded away until the roar of the court became distant and scritchy, like the music in someone else's headphones. Mort saw Death standing companionably by the king, his eyes turned upwards. His eyes turned up towards the minstrel gallery. Mort saw the bowman, saw the bow, saw the bolt now winging through the air at the speed of a sick snail. Slow as it was, he couldn't outrun it. It seemed like hours before he could bring his leaden legs under control. But finally, he managed to get both feet to touch the floor at the same time and kicked away with all apparent acceleration of continental drift. As he twisted slowly through the air, Death said, without rancor, It won't work, you know. It's only natural that you should want to try, but it won't work. Dreamlike, Mort drifted through a silent world. The bolt struck. Death brought his sword around in a double-handed swing that passed gently through the king's neck without leaving a mark. To Mort, spiraling gently through the twilight world, it looked as though a ghostly shape had dropped away. It couldn't be the king, because he was manifestly still standing there, looking directly at Death with an expression of extreme surprise. There was a shadowy something around his feet, and a long way away people were reacting with shouts and screams. A good clean job, said Death. Royalty are always a problem. They tend to want to hang on. Your average peasant now, he can't wait. Who the hell are you? Said the king. What are you doing here? Eh? Guards, I demand... The insistent message from his eyes finally battered through to his brain. Mort was impressed. King Olerv hadn't held on to his throne for many years, and even when dead, knew how to behave. Oh, he said. I didn't expect to see you so soon. Your Majesty, said Death, bowing. Few do. The king looked around. It was quiet and dim in this shadow world, but outside there seemed to be a lot of excitement. That's me down there, is it? I'm afraid so, sire. Clean job. Crossbow, was it? Yes, and now, sire, if you would. Who did it? Said the king. Death hesitated. A hired assassin from Ankh-Morpork, he said. Clever. I congratulate Stow-Hellet. And here's me filling myself with antidotes. No antidote to cold steel, eh? Eh, indeed not, sire. The old rope ladder and fast horse by the drawbridge trick, eh? It would appear so, sire, said Death, taking the king's shade gently by the arm. If it's any consolation, though, the horse needs to be fast. Death allowed his fixed grin to widen a little. I have an appointment with its rider tomorrow in Ankh, said Death. You see, he allowed the Duke to provide him with a packed lunch. The king, whose eminent suitability for his job meant that he was not automatically quick on the uptake, considered this for a moment and then gave a short laugh. He noticed Mort for the first time. Who's this? He said. He dead too? My apprentice, said Death, who will be getting a good talking to before he's much older, the scallywag. Mort, said Mort automatically. The sound of their talking washed around him, but he couldn't take his eyes off the scene around them. He felt real. Death looked solid, the king looked surprisingly fit and well for someone who was dead, but the rest of the world was a mass of sliding shadows. Figures were bent over the slumped body, moving through Mort as if they were no more substantial than a mist. The girl was kneeling down, weeping. "That's my daughter," said the king. "I ought to feel sad. Why don't I?" "Emotions get left behind. It's all a matter of glands." "Ah, that would be it, I suppose. She can't see us, can she?" "No." "I suppose there's no chance that I could." "None," said Death. "Oh, only she's going to be queen, and if I could only let her—" "Sorry." The girl looked up and through Mort. He watched the Duke walk up behind her and lay a comforting hand on her shoulder, a faint smile hovering around the man's lips. It was the sort of smile that lies on sandbanks waiting for incautious swimmers. "I can't make you hear me," Mort said. "Don't trust him." She peered at Mort. Screwing up her eyes, he reached out and watched his hand pass straight through hers. "Come along, boy. No lollygagging." Mort felt Death's hand tighten on his shoulder, not in an unfriendly fashion. He turned away reluctantly, following Death and the king. They walked out through the hall. He was halfway after them before he realized that walking through walls was impossible. The suicidal logic of this nearly killed him. He felt the chill of the stone around his limbs before a voice in his ear said, "Look at it this way. The wall can't be there. Otherwise you wouldn't be walking through it. Would you, boy?" "Mort," said Mort. "What?" "My name is Mort, or Mortimer." "My name is Mort, or Mortimer," said Mort angrily, pushing forwards. The chill fell behind him. "There, that wasn't so hard, was it?" Mort looked up and down the length of the corridor and slapped the wall experimentally. He must have walked through it, but it felt solid enough now. Little specks of mica glittered at him. "How do you do that stuff?" he said. "How do I do it? Is it magic?" "Magic is the one thing it isn't, boy. When you can do it by yourself, there will be nothing more that I can teach you." The king, who was considerably more diffused now, said, "It's impressive, I'll grant you. By the way, I seem to be fading." "It's the morphogenetic field weakening," said Death. The king's voice was no louder than a whisper. "Is that what it is?" "It happens to everyone. Try to enjoy it." "How?" Now the voice was no more than a shape in the air. "Just be yourself." At that moment the king collapsed, growing smaller and smaller in the air as the field finally collapsed into a tiny, brilliant pinpoint. It happened so quickly that Mort almost missed it, from ghost to mote in half a second, with a faint sigh. Death gently caught the glittering thing and stowed it away somewhere under his robe. "What's happened to him?" said Mort. "Only he knows," said Death. "Come." "My granny says that dying is like going to sleep," Mort added, a shade hopeful. Shade hopeful. Mort added, a shade hopefully. Hmm. "I wouldn't know. I've done neither." Mort took a last look along the corridor. The big doors had been flung back, and the court was spilling out. Two older women were endeavoring to comfort the princess, but she was striding ahead of them so that they bounced along behind her like a couple of fussy balloons. They disappeared up another corridor. "Already a queen," said Death approvingly. Death-like style. They were on the roof before he spoke again. "You tried to warn him," he said, removing Binky's nosebag. "Yes, sir. Sorry." "You cannot interfere with fate. Who are you to judge who should live and who should die?" Death watched Mort's expression carefully. "Only the gods are allowed to do that," he added. "To tinker with the fate of even one individual could destroy the whole world. Do you understand?" Mort nodded miserably. "Are you going to send me home?" he said. Death reached down and swung him up behind the saddle. "Because you showed compassion?" "No. I might have done if you had shown pleasure, but you must learn the compassion proper to your trade." "What's that?" "A sharp edge." Annette Castle, would you like to
Yeah,
take over?
yeah. I'd be glad to. Days passed, although Mort wasn't certain how many. The gloomy sun of Death's world rolled regularly across the sky, but the visits to mortal space seemed to adhere to no particular system. Nor did Death visit only kings in important battles. Most of the personal visits were to quite ordinary people. Meals were served up by Albert, who smiled to himself a lot and didn't say anything much. Isabel kept to her room most of the time, or rode her own pony in the black moors above the cottage. The sight of her with her hair streaming in the wind would have been more impressive if she was a better horsewoman, or if the pony had been rather larger, or if her hair was the sort that streams naturally. Some hair has got it and some hasn't, and Hers hadn't. When he wasn't out on what Death referred to as the duty, Mort assisted Albert or found jobs in the garden and stable, or browsed through Death's extensive library, reading with the speed and omnivorousness common to those who discover the magic of the written word for the first time. Most of the books in the library were biographies, of course. They were unusual in one respect. They were writing themselves. People who had already died, obviously, filled their books from cover to cover, and those who hadn't been born yet had to put up with blank pages. Those in between, Mort took note, marking the place and counting the extra lines, and estimated that some books were adding paragraphs at the rate of 4 or 5 every day. He didn't recognize the handwriting. And finally, he plucked up his courage. "A what?" said Death in astonishment, sitting behind his ornate desk and turning his scythe-shaped paper knife over and over in his hands. An afternoon off," repeated Mort. The room suddenly seemed to be oppressively big, with himself very exposed in the middle of a carpet about the size of a field. "But why?" said Death. It can't be to attend your grandmother's funeral," he added. "I would know." "I just want to, get out and meet people," said Mort, trying to outstare that unflinching blue gaze. Excuse me. "But you meet people every day," protested Death. "Yes, I know. Only, well, not for very long," said Mort. "I mean, it'd be nice to meet someone with a life expectancy of more than a few minutes, sir," he added. Death drummed his fingers on the desk, making a sound not unlike a mouse tap dancing, and gave Mort another few seconds of stare. He noticed that the boy seemed rather less elbows than he remembered, stood a little more upright, and, bluntly, could use a word like expectancy. It was all that library. "All right," he said grudgingly, "but it seems to me you have everything you need right here. The duty is not onerous, is it? Is it onerous? I don't know." "No, sir." "And you have good food, and a warm bed, and recreation, and people your own age." "Pardon, sir," said Mort. "My daughter," said Death. "You have met her, I believe." "Oh, yes, sir." "She has a very warm personality when you get to know her." "I'm sure she has, sir." "Nevertheless, you wish—" Death launched the words with a spin of distaste. "An afternoon off." "Yes, sir, if you please, sir." "Very well. So be it. You may have until sunset." Death opened his great ledger, picked up a pen, and began to write. Occasionally he'd reach out and flick the beads of an abacus. After a moment he looked up. "You're still here," he said. "And in your own time, too," he added sourly. Said Mort. "Will people be able to see me, sir?" "I imagine so, I'm sure," said Death. "Is there anything else I might be able to assist you with before you leave for this debauch? Is that it? I'm going to go with debauch." "Well, sir, there is one thing, sir. I don't know how to get to the mortal world, sir," said Mort desperately. Death sighed loudly and pulled open a desk drawer. "Just walk there." Mort nodded miserably and took the long walk to the study door. As he pulled it open, Death coughed. "Boy!" he called, and tossed something across the room. Mort caught it automatically as the door creaked open. The doorway vanished. The deep carpet underfoot became muddy cobbles. Broad daylight poured over him like quicksilver. "Mort," said Mort to the universe at large. "What?" said a stall-holder beside him. Mort stared around. He was in a crowded marketplace, packed with people and animals. Every kind of thing was being sold, from needles to, via a few itinerant prophets, visions of salvation. It was impossible to hold on to any conversation quieter than a shout. Mort tapped the stall-holder in the small of the back. "Can you see me?" he demanded. The stall-holder squinted critically at him. "I reckon so," he said. "Or someone very much like you." "Thank you," said Mort, immensely relieved. "Don't mention it. I see lots of people every day, no charge. Want to buy any bootlaces?" I don't think so," said Mort. What place is this? You don't know? A couple of people at the next stall were looking at Mort thoughtfully. His mind went into overdrive. My master travels a lot, he said truthfully. We arrived last night and I was asleep on the cart. Now I've got the afternoon off. Ah, said the stall holder. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Looking for a good time, are you? I could fix you up. I'd quite enjoy knowing where I am, Mort conceded. The man was taken aback. This is Ankh-Morpork, he said. Anyone ought to be able to see that. Smell it, too. Mort sniffed. There was a certain something about the air in the city. You got the feeling that it was air that had seen life. You couldn't help noticing with every breath that thousands of other people were very close to you, and nearly all of them had armpits. The stall holder regarded Mort critically, noting the pale face, well-cut clothes, and strange presence. A sort of coiled spring effect. Look, I'll be frank, he said. I could point you in the direction of a great brothel. I've already had lunch, said Mort vaguely. But you can tell me if we're anywhere near, I think it's called Stolat? Oh, about 20 miles hubwards, but there's nothing there for a young man of your kidney, said the trader hurriedly. I know you're out by yourself. You want new experiences, you want excitement, you want romance. Mort, meanwhile, had opened the bag Death had given him. It was full of small gold coins about the size of sequins. An image formed again in his mind of a pale young face under a head of red hair who had somehow known that he was there. The unfocused feelings that had haunted his mind for the last few days suddenly sharpened to a point. I want, he said firmly, a very fast horse. 5 minutes later, Mort was lost. This part of Ankh-Morpork was known as the Shades, an inner-city area sorely in need of either governmental help or, for preference, a flamethrower. It couldn't be called squalid, because that would be stretching the word to a breaking point. It was beyond squalor, and out the other side, where, by a sort of Einsteinian reversal, it achieved a magnificent horribleness that it wore like an architectural award. It was noisy and sultry and smelled like a cowshed floor. It didn't have so much a neighborhood as an ecology, like a great land-based coral reef. There were humans, all right, humanoid equivalents of lobsters, squid, shrimps, and so on. And sharks. Mort wandered hopelessly along the winding streets. Anyone hovering at rooftop height would have noticed a certain pattern in the crowds behind him, suggesting a number of men converging nonchalantly on a target, and would rightly have concluded that Mort and his gold had about the same life expectancy as a three-legged hedgehog on a six-lane motorway. It's probably already apparent that the Shades was not the sort of place to have inhabitants. It had denizens. Periodically, Mort would try to engage one in conversation, to find the way to a good horse dealer. The denizen would usually mutter something and hurry away, since anyone wishing to live in the Shades for longer than maybe 3 hours developed very specialized senses indeed, and would no more hang around near Mort than a peasant would stand near a tall tree in thundery weather. And so Mort came at last to the river Ankh, greatest of rivers. Even before it entered the city, it was slow and heavy with the silt of the plains. By the time it got to the Shades, even an agnostic could have walked across it. It was hard to drown in the Ankh, but easy to suffocate. Mort looked at the surface doubtfully. It seemed to be moving. There were bubbles in it. It had to be water. He sighed and turned away. 3 men had appeared behind him, as though extruded from the stonework. They had the heavy, stolid look of those thugs whose appearance in any narrative means that it's time for the hero to be menaced a bit, although not too much, because it's also obvious that they're going to get horribly surprised. They were leering, and they were good at it. One of them had drawn a knife, which he waved in little circles in the air. He advanced slowly towards Mort, while the other 2 hung back to provide immoral support. "Give us the money," he rasped. Mort's hand went to the bag on his belt. "Hang on a minute," he said. "Is it what happens then?" "What?" "I mean, is it my money or my life?" said Mort. "That's the sort of thing that robbers are supposed to demand, your money or your life. I read that in a book once," he added. Possibly, conceded the robber. He felt he was losing the initiative, but rallied magnificently. "On the other hand, it could be your money and your life. Pulling off the double, you might say." The man looked sideways at his colleagues, who snickered on cue. Well, in that case, said Mort, and hefted the bag in one hand. And hefted the bag in one hand, preparatory to chucking it as far out into the onk as he could, even though there was a reasonable chance it would bounce. Hey, what are you doing? Said the robber. He started to run forward, but halted when Mort gave the bag a threatening jerk. Well, said Mort, I look at it like this. If you're going to kill me anyway, I might as well get rid of the money. It's entirely up to you. To illustrate his point, he took one coin out of the bag and flicked it out across the river, which accepted it with an unfortunate sucking noise. The thieves shuddered. The leading thief looked at the bag. He looked at his knife. He looked at Mort's face. He looked at his colleagues. Excuse me, he said, and they went into a huddle. Mort measured the distance to the end of the alley. He wouldn't make it. Anyway, these three looked as though chasing people was another thing they were good at. It was only logic that left them feeling a little stretched. Their leader turned back to Mort. He gave a final glance at the other two. They both nodded decisively. I think we kill you and take a chance on the money, he said. We don't want this sort of thing to spread. The other two drew their knives. Mort swallowed. This could be unwise, he said. Why? Well, I won't like it, for one. You're not supposed to like it, you're supposed to die, said the thief, advancing. Well, I don't think I'm due to die, said Mort, backing away. I'm sure I would have been told. Yeah, said the thief, who's getting fed up with this. Yeah, well, you have been, haven't you? Great steaming elephant turds. Mort had just stepped backwards again, through a wall. The leading thief glared at the solid stone that had swallowed Mort, and then he threw down his knife. Well, fuck me, he said. A fucking wizard. I hate fucking wizards. It's censored there, but I think that's what he said. No, you shouldn't fuck them then, muttered one of his henchmen, effortlessly pronouncing a row of dashes. The third member of the trio, who was a little slow of thinking, said, Hey, he walked through the wall! And we've been following him for ages, too, muttered the other one. Fine one you are, Pilgarlic. I said I thought he was a wizard. Only wizards walk around here by themselves. Didn't I say he looked like a wizard? I said... You're saying a good deal too much, growled the leader. I saw him. He walked right through the wall there. Oh, yeah? Yeah, right through it, didn't you see? Think you're sharp, do you? Sharp enough, come to that. The leader scooped his knife out of the dirt in one shaky, snarky, snaky? Okay, the word is fucking snaky, I guess. One snaky movement. Sharp as this? The third thief lurched over to the wall and kicked it hard a few times, while behind him there were the sounds of a scuffle and some damp, bubbling noises. Yep, it's a wall, okay, he said. It's a wall if ever I saw one. How do you think they do it, lads? Lads? He tripped over the prone bodies. Oh, he said. Slow as his mind was, it was quick enough to realize something very important. He was in a back alley in the shades, and he was now alone. He ran for it and got quite a long way. Death walked slowly across tiles in the Lifetimer room, inspecting the serried rows of busy hourglasses. Albert followed dutifully behind him, with the great ledger open in his arms. The sound roared around them, a vast gray waterfall of noise. It came from the shelves where, stretching away into the infinite distance, row upon row of hourglasses poured away the sands of mortal time. It was a heavy sound, a dull sound, a sound that poured like sullen custard over the bright roly-poly pudding of the soul. Very well, said Death at last. I make it 3. A quiet night. That'd be Goody Hamstring, the Abbot Lansing again, and this Princess Kelly, said Albert. Death looked at the 3 hourglasses in his hand. I was thinking of sending the lad out, he said. Albert consulted his ledger. Well, Goody wouldn't be any trouble, and the Abbot is what you might call experienced, he said. Shame about the princess, only 15. Could be tricky. Yes, it is a pity. Master. Death stood with the third glass in his hand, staring thoughtfully at the play of light across its surface. He sighed. One so young. Are you feeling all right, Master? Said Albert, his voice full of concern. Time, like an ever-rolling stream, bears all its... Master! What? Said Death, snapping out of it. You've been overdoing it, Master, that's what it is. What are you blathering about, man? Had a bit of a funny turn there, Master. Nonsense. I have never felt better. What were we talking about? Albert shrugged and peered down at the entries in the book. Goody's a witch, he said. She might get a bit annoyed if you send Mort. All practitioners of magic earn the right, once their own personal sands had run out, of being claimed by Death himself, rather than as minor functionaries. Death didn't appear to hear Albert. He was staring at Princess Kelly's hourglass again. What is that sense inside your head of wistful regret that things are the way they apparently are? Sadness, Master, I think. Now, I am sadness. Albert stood with his mouth open. Finally he got a grip on himself long enough to blurt out, Master, we were talking about Mort. Mort who? Your apprentice, Master, said Albert patiently. Tall young lad. Of course. Well, we'll send him. Is he ready to go solo, Master? Said Albert doubtfully. Death thought about it. He can do it, he said at last. He's keen, he's quick to learn, and really, he added, people can't expect to have me running around after them all the time. Mort stared blankly at the velvet wall hangings a few inches from his eyes. I've walked through a wall, he thought, and that's impossible. He gingerly moved the hangings aside to see if a door was lurking somewhere, but there was nothing but crumbling plaster, which had cracked away in places to reveal some dampish but emphatically solid brickwork. Emphatically solid brickwork, that makes a lot more sense. He prodded it experimentally. It was clear that he wasn't going back out the other way. Well, he said to the wall, what now? A voice behind him said, excuse, please? He turned around slowly. Grouped around a table in the middle of the room was a Clatchian family of father, mother, and half a dozen children of dwindling size. 8 pairs of round eyes were fixed on Mort. A 9th pair, belonging to an aged grandparent of indeterminate sex, weren't, because their owner had taken advantage of the interruption to get some elbow room at the communal rice bowl, taking the view that a boiled fish in the hand was worth any amount of unexplained manifestations, and the silence was punctuated by the sound of determined mastication. In one corner of the crowded room was a little shrine to Offlar, the 6-armed crocodile god of Clatch. It was grinning just like Death, except, of course, Death didn't have a flock of holy birds that brought him news of his worshippers, and also kept his teeth clean. Clatchians prize hospitality above all other virtues. As Mort stared, the woman took another plate off the shelf behind her and silently began to fill it from the big bowl, snatching a choice cut of catfish from the ancient's hands after a brief struggle. Her kohl-rimmed eyes remained steadily on Mort, however. It was the father who had spoken. Mort bowed nervously. Sorry, he said. I seem to have walked through this wall. It was rather lame, he had to admit. Please? Said the man. The woman, her bangles jangling, carefully arranged a few slices of pepper across the plate and sprinkled it with dark green sauce that Mort was afraid he recognized. He'd tried it a few weeks before. Although it was a complicated recipe, one taste had been enough to know that it was made out of fish entrails, marinated for several years in a vat of shark bile. Death had said that it was an acquired taste. Mort had decided not to make the effort. He tried to sidle around the edge of the room towards the bead-hung doorway, all heads turning to watch him. He tried a grin. The woman said, Why does the demon show his teeth, husband of my life? The man said, Could be hunger, moon of my desire. Pile on more flesh. And the ancestor grumbled, I was eating that, wretched child. Woe unto the world when there is no respect for age. Now, the fact that while the words entered Mort's ear in their spoken Clatchian, with all the curlicues and subtle diphthongs of a language so ancient and sophisticated that it had 15 words meaning assassination before the rest of the world had caught on to the idea of bashing one another over the head with rocks, they arrived in his brain as clear and understandable as his mother's tongue. "I'm no demon, I'm a human," he said, and stopped in shock as his words emerged in perfect Clatch. "You're a thief?" said the father. "A murderer? To creep in thus, are you a tax gatherer?" His hand slipped under the table and came up holding a meat cleaver honed to paper thinness. His wife screamed and dropped the plate and clutched the youngest children to her. Mort watched the blade weave through the air and gave in. "I bring you greetings from the uttermost circles of hell," he hazarded. The change was remarkable. The cleaver was lowered and the family broke into broad smiles. "There is much luck to us if a demon visits," beamed the father. "What is your wish, O foul spawn of Offler's loins?" Sorry," said Mort. "A demon brings blessing and good fortune on the man that helps it," said the man. "How may we be of assistance, O evil dog's breath of the nether pit?" Well, I'm not very hungry," said Mort, "but if you know where I can get a fast horse, I could be in Stolat before sunset." The man beamed and bowed. "I know the very place, noxious extrusion of the bowels, if you would be so good as to follow me." Mort hurried out after him. The ancient ancestor watched them go with a critical expression, its jowls rhythmically chewing. "That was what they call a demon around here," it said. "Offler wrought this country of dampness. Even their demons are third rate, not a patch on the demons we had in the old country." The wife placed a small bowl of rice in the folded middle pair of hands of the Offler statue. It would be gone in the morning, and stood back. "Husband did say that the last month of the curry gardens he served a creature who was not there," she said. "He was impressed." 10 minutes later the man returned and, in solemn silence, placed a small heap of gold coins on the table. They represented enough wealth to purchase quite a large part of the city. "He had a back of them," he said. The family stared at the money for some time. The wife sighed. "Riches bring many problems," she said. "What are we to do?" "We return to Clatch," said the husband firmly, "where our children can grow up in a proper country, true to the glorious traditions of our ancient race, and men do not need to work as waiters for wicked masters, but can stand tall and proud. And we must leave right now, fragrant blossom of the date palm." "Why so soon, O hard-working son of the desert?" "Because," said the man, "I have just sold the patrician's champion racehorse." "Got a few minutes left. You want to take us home?"
Yeah.
All right.
Let's see. Let me take another sip of water and then I will finish off the night for us. The horse wasn't as fine or as fast as Binky, but it swept the miles away under its hooves and easily outdistanced a few mounted guards, who, for some reason, appeared anxious to talk to Mort. Soon the shanty suburbs of Moorpork were left behind, and the road ran out into rich black earth country of the Stowe Plain, constructed over eons by the periodic flooding of the Great Slough Onk that brought to the region prosperity, security, and chronic arthritis. It was also extremely boring. As the light distilled from silver to gold, Mort galloped across a flat, chilly landscape checkered with cabbage fields from edge to edge. There are many things that can be said about cabbages. One may talk at length about their high vitamin content, their vital iron contribution, their valuable roughage, and commendable food value. In the mass, however, they lack a certain something. Despite their claim to immense nutritional and moral superiority over, say, daffodils, they have never been a sight to inspire the poet's muse. Unless he was hungry, of course. It was only 20 miles to Stolat, but in terms of uh, meaningless human experience, it seemed like 2,000. There were guards on the gates of Stolat, although compared to the ones that patrolled Ankh, they had a sheepish, amateurish look. Mort trotted past, and one of them, feeling a bit of a fool, asked him who went there. "I'm afraid I can't stop," said Mort. The guard was new to his job and quite keen. Guarding wasn't what he'd been led to expect. Standing around all day in chainmail on a long pole wasn't what he'd volunteer for. He expected its excitement and challenge and a crossbow and a uniform that didn't go rusty in the rain. He stepped forward, ready to defend the city against people who didn't respect commands given by duly authorized civic employees. Mort considered the pike blade hovering a few inches from his face. There was getting to be too much of this. On the other hand, he said calmly, how would you like it if I made you a present of this rather fine horse? It wasn't hard to find the entrance to the castle. There were guards there, too, and they had crossbows and a considerably more unsympathetic outlook on life, and in any case, Mort had run out of horses. He loitered a bit until they started paying him a generous amount of attention, and then wandered disconsolately away into the streets of the little city, feeling stupid. After all this, after miles of brassicas and a backside that now felt like a block of wood, he didn't even know why he was there. So he'd seen him even when he was invisible. Did it mean anything? Of course it didn't. Only he kept seeing her face, and the flicker of hope in her eyes. He wanted to tell her that everything was going to be alright. He wanted to tell her about himself and everything he wanted to be. He wanted to find out which was her room in the castle, and watch it all night until the light went out, and so on. A little later, a blacksmith, whose business was in one of the narrow streets that looked out onto the castle walls, glanced up from his work to see a tall, gangling young man, rather red in the face, who kept trying to walk through the walls. Rather later than that, a young man with a few superficial bruises on his head called in at one of the city's taverns and asked for directions to the nearest wizard. And it was later still that Mort turned up outside a peeling plaster house, which announced itself on a blackened brass plaque to be the abode of Igneous Cutwell, DM, unseen, master of the infinite, uh, Illuminardus, wizard to princes, guardian of the sacred portals. If out, leave mail with Mrs. Nugent next door. Would we like to call it there?
I think that's a good spot.
All right.
Well, I think.
Well done.
Yeah, I think it's been a great first reading. Let's see how far we got.
In my printing, we are uh, 57 pages in.
I'm at 72.
Damn, you got extra pages up at the front.
I just have a very small book. I would say we are actually, wow, I forgot this book is not that long.
Oh, no, definitely not.
We are probably coming up on a quarter of it. Let me do the math. Yeah, based on my page counts, we are 24% through it. Wow.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's exciting. I didn't realize it was going to go so fast. Fantastic. Well, thank you for being on the program. I hope to see you again next
Yeah, of
week.
course.
And,
I'll certainly be here.
yeah, I am going to go ahead and move us into our stream ending. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
See ya.
All right. Wow, I am mystified by how short this book is. I did not remember it as a short book. I did not realize we would be a quarter of the way through. That's crazy. Hope you guys have enjoyed it so far. Yeah, I think it's a lovely, lovely book. And it's a lot of fun to read, even though it's done with some difficulty. And, geez. If that goes over really well, there are plenty of other Discworld books that I would love to have on the program. But now I'm realizing that I really got to, if this is only going to take a month, I really got to line up another book sooner than I thought I would have to. So if you are looking to be a partner on the show and you have a book that you really are passionate about, feel free to approach me. I am only accepting books that I have read, unfortunately, so you may have to work with me a little bit. But, you know, I'm sure at some point we're going to run out of books that I have read and we're going to turn to books that I haven't. And maybe we'll experiment with that a little bit in a couple months. But yeah, as of right now, I would like to keep it to books I have read, just because I want to know the content warnings ahead of time and stuff, and I want to know what I want to say about the book ahead of time, when we're giving our thoughts and stuff. But yeah, hope you guys are having fun so far. I'm very excited to read this book. This book is a lot of fun. But now it's bedtime, and especially for me, because I have an exam in the morning. Okay, bedtime. Bye bye, everyone. Thank you.